Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm AndyRC and today I'm taking a look at the iFlight TurboBee 120 RS. This is an ultralight 2.5 inch brushless model that is available in either a 2S version or a 4S version. Now, be really careful with this because if you got this guy from Banggood, then I think they have incorrectly listed the 2S model as also supporting 3S. The reason I say this is the iFlight website states that it's only meant for 2S, and when you look at the figures, I'd say that that was right. So the 2S version comes with an 1103 10,000 kV naked bottom brushless motor, and if you look at models like the Toothpick and the Sailfly, which are 3S capable models, they are using 8,000 kV 1103 motors, and that's also with the less demanding dual blade props that aren't going to demand as much current. This model comes with the Gemfan Flash 2540 props, which are designed for a 3S to 4S LiPo, but not at this kV. So if we take the 10,000 kV and times that by a 2S high volt, which they say it can handle, then the RPM would be 87,000. And considering the model like the SkyStars X120, which is designed for a 4S on this same propeller, it's using an 1106 4500 kV motor, and with those values the motors are running this prop at just 75,600 RPM, and they get blooming warm at the same time. So just to compare, if you put a 3S through these 10,000 kV motors, they would be running at 126,000 RPM, which is just way too much for this model. So I think you could get away with a few flights of this guy on 3S, but these props aren't designed to run at those kind of RPMs. And I think once the prop gets past the RPM it was designed for, especially as they are not a particularly high pitch prop either, they will start to deflect and vibrate, and that would potentially give you loads of jello in the camera, and after a while it could burn up your motors. As another comparison, the 4S version of the 120 RS comes with an 1104 4200 kV motor, so when we calculate the RPM of what that motor at 4S voltage would be running at, then you get 70,560 RPM. So yes, this model on a 2S will have more thrust and more RPM than the 4S version, especially as it's going to be lighter as well, so I think it's going to be faster. Now, you could, in theory, use a smaller prop on the 2S version, like a 2-inch, but I would say that that would be counterproductive, as the entire point of this model taking a 2.5-inch prop is to have loads of thrust while at the same time being light, and with a 2-inch prop and a heavier 3S LiPo, I think you would get less power. The shaft of these motors can take the 65mm dual blades that Gemfan and Pyrodrone sell, but even with 3S on the Toothpick model at 8,000 kV, the props deflected too much and produced a load of vibrations along the way. So even with that model I recommended 2S despite it being able to handle 3S. So with all that being said, let's take a look at the rest of the specs. The model comes pre-built like this and weighs 57 grams without a LiPo. iFlight recommend a 450 mAh 2S LiPo, and it weighs 86.2 grams with one of those. But with the interest of going lighter, I might try a 300 mAh 2S, as it's 9 grams lighter, with 77 grams being its all-up weight with the 300 mAh 2S. But either way, this is a very light model, and taking these props into consideration, the 450 mAh LiPo might be able to provide more current than the 300 mAh LiPo, because the 450 milliamps larger capacity and same C rating as the 300 mAh will mean that in theory it can provide slightly more current, and more current means less voltage sag, therefore more RPMs. Anyways, the frame is a stretched X, and I think the arms are the thinnest that I have seen in the business. However, they are actually 3mm thick with no flex whatsoever. And as this is a super light model, it would take a really heavy crash, perhaps on concrete, to break an arm. And even then, I think it would be a challenge. However, if you did break an arm, then this is a unibody, so you would have to replace the entire bottom plate. Then we've got some tape to secure down the motor wires, but I was sad to see that there wasn't any anti-slip Lipo mat provided, so I stole this one from a diatone model. Otherwise, the screws are going to dig into your battery. The fitted Lipo strap won't fit around any 3S Lipos, by the way, only a 2S. However, they have provided 2 spare straps at different lengths, but I would just see this as something that they provide in each version, whether it's the 2S or the 4S version. You also get a spare set of the gem fan props, as well as the screws for the props, which you only get one set of, and they are mixed into this bag of spare screws. So the ones for the props are the longer kind, and you do have to use them because the gem fans don't tension fit. It's worth mentioning that you might be able to top mount a battery on this model, however it would interfere with the antenna of the VTX. So next onto the main stack, which has some pretty mind-blowing stats and full props to iFlight for this. So it's the 16x16 success stack. Everything is soft mounted, including the ESCs, which are a BL Heli S 12 amp continuous 4-in-1 board, which is powered by an XT30 connector. The stack will take a 4S, it's just the motors that can't. So in the 4S version, the stack is the same. There's no current meter on this guy, which at this size I think you can forgive them for. There is no extra capacitor installed, so we'll have to see what the video noise is like, although I can see a few ceramic capacitors built into the board, which is impressive, especially for this size. Then above that we have an F4 flight controller flash with Betaflight version 3.57. And I have to say the setup was pretty spot on. I think I just changed my rates and moved the on-screen display around, adding the RSSI to channel 8 via the RXSR, but they have put their own PIDs in there, so I've left those the same. Then above the FC we have a switching VTX from pit mode to 25 milliwatt up to 200 milliwatt. It has a button on it, but it's really hard to get to at the back, so I just use the tramp protocol, which has been set up on one of the UARTs. It's also using a micro UFL connector, which I guess you kind of have to at this size, but its linear antenna is housed in this 3D printed mount, so it shouldn't really move, and the mount also houses the receiver's antennas, which I like. My only complaint is that it has a tendency to slip down, which does bring the VTX antenna in range of the props, so perhaps some adhesive is needed there on the back standoff to stop it from doing that. So this is the RXSR version that has come flashed with the FCC D16 firmware. You can just about access the bind button from the top, but what sets this one apart is that it's available with any protocol type that you can imagine. So there's a FlySky 2A version and a Spectrum version, even a Futaba and Crossfire Nano version, and they do an XM Plus version as well if you don't want the RXSR. And then lastly we have got the camera, which is the Cadex Turbo EOS 2, but it's the 16x9 version, not the 4x3 version. And I know there are some people out there saying that it's the 4x3 version, but it's not, so I thought it's worth mentioning. It's also housed in a way that I'm not a fan of on some TPU mounts. This usually always gives Jello with a CMOS camera, so some carbon plates on the side would have been a better option. The Asteroid 3 is a good example of this, as it uses the same camera, albeit the 4x3 version, and there is no Jello because it's mounted in carbon fiber. And that's about it, so let's go and take it for a fly. Okay, first of all, let's see what this guy is like on a 300 milliamp 2S and it leaped into the sky straight away. It is completely silent. So let's see what the punch is like. Yeah, plenty of punch to have fun with this guy. Don't think the flight time is going to be too hot on 300 milliamp there with that amount of punch. It's not a scary amount. And yeah, I can barely hear that. See if I can get it closer to the camera. No vibrations or anything like that. Just completely silent. I try and keep it in close to the camera because it's a tiny thing, this, and I think a lot of people will appreciate that. Not intimidating at all, doesn't make any noise. I'm struggling to hear the throttle value over the cars on the road over the side there. And on a 300 milliamp 2S, not hearing any oscillations. Not hearing anything though. It'd be difficult to hear oscillations. No, I think you would hear them, but man, that is very quiet. Yeah, I reckon maybe a sub 3-minute flight time with a 300 milliamp Lipo. Maybe even a 2-minute flight time. But it's flying nice and it's got bags of power. Already though, I can feel a little bit of sag. So let's bring it in and see how it behaves on a 450 milliamp. This is charged to a high volt and so is the 450 milliamp. Okay, so a 450 milliamp 2S GMB Lipo charged to a high volt just about fits in the battery strap, and already it's not leaping into the air, so let's see what the punch is like. I think it's got even more punch, you know, and I think that's probably because it can provide slightly more amps even though it's heavier. Now, it's a common misconception that a heavier battery will bog down the model, but if it can provide more amps, then actually you'll get more punch out of it. And wow, yeah, quite a bit more punch out of this one. So I think 450 milliamp is the way to go with this guy. Again, it's nice and quiet, not hearing any oscillations, so seems like 300 milliamp and 450 milliamp charged to a high volt will be fine with this model. It's flying nicely in acro, just as it was on 300 milliamp. But it seems like their suggested Lipo size of 450 milliamp is the one to go for with this guy. Yeah, quite a bit more punch on the 450 milliamp. Surprising, and I imagine we'll get a longer flight time. So let's see what the difference is in FPV. But again, on 450 milliamp, just want to sort of show you how quiet the thing is. Very quiet indeed. Okay, let's bring it in for a landing and do some FPV with it.
So this is just the tail end of the 300 milliamp 2S Lipo. I only got a 2-minute and 22 flight time. So I would say stick with the 450 milliamp battery and just look at the voltage here. Watch how quickly it drops and then it just falls out of the sky. So be careful of that, but you can see 2 minutes 22. So this is the 450 milliamp 2S, and the first thing that I want you to pay attention to is the throttle value. It is so low, it's like 20%. Can you see most of the time? So 20% for a hover, and it's really low in general, just cruising around, look, 20% again. Now, This was the same day that I actually flew the Asteroid 3, and it's amazing the difference between the 4x3 camera and the 16x9 camera, because if you look back one video, the Asteroid 3 had the sun as a black dot, whereas the 16x9 camera, it has got the sun there shown nicely, but I don't think the dynamic range is quite as nice on this. And you'll also see some flickering lines across the image as well, and that was not related to the ESCs. Those lines were there when the motors weren't armed, so there's some kind of RF shielding needed, I think, from the VTX. Perhaps it's picking up some noise from the regulator of the flight controller. Either way, it's not debilitating, but I thought I would mention it. Now, check out the voltage. It is not sagging whatsoever. We've got plenty of power, and we are not getting too much jello. You know, these are extreme conditions. It is golden hour, we have got the sun out, and even on full throttle, we're just getting a tiny bit of jello. I do think if they had housed this camera better and not used TPU, then there wouldn't have been any jello whatsoever. And I think if you would use a 3S Lipo, then it would just shake the thing to pieces, because these props are not designed for that kind of RPM. But yeah, as you can see, I'm not getting any breakup. I'm just getting a few lines across the screen. That's full throttle there. So I would estimate around about 45 mile per hour to 50 mile per hour maybe. So it's very unintimidating. So that's a good thing, I think, especially as we don't have the best reputation as a hobby. But just look at this, just flying really nicely here. Can't complain about the tune whatsoever. Would I recommend this model? Yes, I think I would. It's inconspicuous, it's safe, it's light, and you can do all of the maneuvers that you can do with a bigger model. The only thing that I think is a bit of a downside is the camera. I'd probably even stick the 4x3 camera on there, because I think it deals with dynamic range better, or figure out how to get a CCD camera on there, because maybe that would fit actually, and it would deal better with the jello as well. But I'm not getting much jello here. I'm getting more lines and RF interference, not signal breakup, but RF interference. Anyways, check out the flight time. We are 3 minutes 30, and I'm flying close to myself here because I know that it just dropped out of the sky very quickly as soon as it got to 6.4 volts, and yeah, it's done that there. So that is my review of the TurboBee 120 RS 2S edition. I'll put a link in the description if you wish to get one, and as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.